Thanks for joining us in this Art of Law episode on strategic stakes in Chinese companies. This is a post recording as there was technical difficulties in the first one, but we hope that you will stick around and hear what Mark has to say about the strategic stakes. For people who are new to the series, the Art of Law series is basically a recording of Mark's thoughts about changes of how China has changed from when he first started practicing to when he wrote this book, The Art of Law, 15 years ago, and fast forward to today.
So I think when we discussed technical difficulty, that was you forgot to press record. I was not sure.
Yeah, some technical problems. I think the button was stuck. So, so Mark, maybe, I think the first question that I have when we're thinking about strategic stakes in Chinese companies is, well, why do we even want to consider taking a stake in a Chinese company?
So I think, what we've seen, a long time ago, people were doing joint ventures when they first came into China because they thought it was necessary in order to really get into the market, and they thought it would be easier, it would require less resources. But when we were looking at people that were doing mostly manufacturing, for B2B, I think people found out that in most cases it wasn't that helpful, and there was a lot of issues with it. But I think we've seen a re-emergence in the last 3, 4, 5 years where companies, like international companies, are looking to buy a strategic stake, and there's often two models. One would be to buy into an existing company, turn it into a joint venture, and either do it together or over time, buy out the Chinese partner, and then, that will be like an earn-out kind of way of doing it. So that is often in manufacturing type projects. But we're also now seeing is that international companies are buying strategic stakes in listed companies, and there's particularly a lot of interest in the Star Exchange. And I think, some of the reasons why people are doing that is that people see it as a way to have, an interesting investment in a Chinese company. Often these companies, if they're going to also bring in technology or some other element, they can be more than just somebody who puts money in. They can add value to the company, and they're often looking just for some, strategic alignment, or they may have a management role. And I think it's something which we're seeing more of now. And one of the also other reasons is China's become such a big market for things, and for a lot of things where it's the Chinese consumer facing, or it's digital, or it's services or software or something like that. In order to really have a big business in China, it's probably difficult. If you're trying to sell to Chinese customers or Chinese businesses, it's difficult to scale it up yourself. And so I think people are looking at this as a way to really do the China business. And they might think we can do Europe or America by ourselves, but in China, let's do a deal. And maybe the earliest forerunner of this that people can think of is when Yahoo, it was before Google, Yahoo was probably the #1 search engine. But after a few years, Yahoo's biggest asset was its minor shareholding in Alibaba. And so, that was a case where you could see the international company investing in a business that it knew. It probably added some value as well. But because the valuation was so high and the China business expanded so quickly, it was really very valuable.
So I know that these kinds of cases are not your everyday type of case, but in your experience, or in your opinion, do you think that the strategic shareholding is usually going to be in a company that complements your business in China in some way, or is it more purely of a speculative investment type investment?
We're dealing mostly with industrial companies or people that make things, or service companies. So we haven't seen one like that. So we haven't seen somebody as a financial. I'm sure there's hedge funds and private equity funds overseas who'd be interested, but these are not things we see. So the ones we've seen so far has been a few in automation. So, because we can't say too much because some of these things are, still ongoing. We saw some in the autonomous car space, mobility, and we did see, years ago, someone did it in the automotive sector where international, and it's a little bit similar to what the Chinese companies are doing as well. If you look, Geely bought, I think it was a 9% stake in Daimler a couple of years ago. So Chinese companies are also buying these strategic stakes, but I haven't seen somebody who does service as a software invest in a Chinese ice cream company. So I think they're equal connection. One of the first companies we saw that did this was a German company, medium-sized German company, never wanted to list, never wanted to do this, but somehow they wound up with a shareholding in a Chinese company, which subsequently listed. And the problem for the German company was it had this small shareholding, but was worth a lot of money. And the problem was they were in the electronics business, and the Chinese company had a sizable defense business, and the German company didn't want to actually be a shareholder in that company. And so they sold that shareholding. This must have been like maybe 7-8 years ago. And, it was much more money they ever made doing business in China was actually selling that stake. So, so I think, the companies that we see that do this do have a connection to the business.
And just to echo, the STAR market is, I guess, similar to the US's NASDAQ market. And we have a separate video, which I'll put in the description below, but you can check out the basically the meteoric rise of the STAR market and Chinese companies listing on the STAR market. And, maybe when you wrote the book 15 years ago, Mark, or even, 10 years or 5 years ago, joint ventures, like you said, might have been the way, but the more ambitious Chinese companies and probably some of the more strategic Chinese partners in some of the more sophisticated industries might be looking at the STAR market or may have already listed on the STAR market. So it is, I guess it's totally foreseeable that, that company that you just mentioned ended up in a, minor shareholding in a listed company. This could be, even though the international company itself may not want that listing, your Chinese partners may. So with that said, Mark, how does one go about acquiring a stake? I put this picture here because there's many ways to cut this. So maybe you just want to give us some different types of methods.
So I think we work with our securities colleagues on these things, but these are really the list of the potential ways that you could do it. You could buy shares by agreement from another shareholder. You might be buying shares, actually traded shares. You might acquire a shareholder of a Chinese company that holds the shares, or you might do a combination. But I really think the one which we've seen so far, it's invariably the Chinese company issues new shares. And there's normally I think every case we've seen, except for one, in all the cases, there was some strategic project involved, but all the cases we've seen also contemplated a joint venture. So let's say, a French company invested in the listed company, but in addition, the listed company entered into a joint venture with the French company in China to exploit the technology or to do a certain type of business. Because it's strategic, we've normally seen the Chinese company issue new shares to the international company. And mostly for cash.
And when you say strategic in that sense, is that going back to the whole, the investment is to fulfill or drive further the business aspect of the actual investment, not the just investment for pure investment stake? Sake.
So I think it's the advantage for those industrial companies. They know the business, but those say, for example, the Star Exchange companies who are younger, probably more nimble, they've raised, most cases, hundreds of millions of renminbi, but in some cases, several billion renminbi. And so these companies, they need to find things to do with the money they've raised. And, they're interested in new markets. There's always a technology element to their business. So a lot of software companies on there, environmental protection companies. So a lot of like modern technology companies are on there. And so I think, they've got the money. This is not the issue at the moment. Raising funds, is not the issue. The issue is, how do you deploy the funds? And I think if you've got a, international company that has got a technology that you believe you can really grow quickly in China, and it's complementary to their business, then it makes a lot of sense. So that's, what we're seeing the synergy as being. Because lots of people have cash. A lot of people feel that they're underweighted in Chinese securities because of the growth in valuations. But that's the advantage for companies who actually make things or do things rather than hedge funds or private equity. They can actually add value, not just bring cash.
That's right. And I think we'll jump on this topic a little bit later, but I just want to get in now since we're on the issue. So in years past, Mark, joint ventures were pretty common, and it still is. But if a joint venture is set up through one of these stakes, does that make the process easier in terms of like due diligence, because they've already been vetted by the Chinese authorities in order to list? Do certain aspects of the process become smoother as a result?
Well, I think, like if you're going to invest in the listed company, the due diligence is limited normally to publicly available documents. You may pick up other information, but you have to be careful about insider trading and things like that. So, probably, I would say, listed companies are much more likely to abide by a contract. There is a certain level of due diligence done by the stock exchange and CSRC that the company is bona fide. But I don't think it's the magic of that. It's just that it's a large company and it is scrutinized. There was a bit of a mini boom in our IP litigation because a lot of these star exchange companies, were sued for IP infringement, and they had to settle relatively quickly because that's a crucial part of their story. So I think overall they're a good joint venture partner because they are public, they are scrutinized, they do have cash, and it's not easy for them to hide.
And maybe we can quickly go over some of the key authorities. I know you've already mentioned a few of them, but these are the ones, and from all different backgrounds. But maybe, Mark, you just can go over them very briefly here.
Yeah, so I think the CSRC might be complicated if you're doing a certain amount, or if it's a material asset restructuring. If, for example, instead of just, shares or something, basically you, contribute your wholly foreign-owned enterprise that has a factory and 1,000 employees, this may be a material restructuring. So CSRC may be involved if there's, certain issuances. The stock exchange, Shenzhen, Shanghai, they'll have their kind of requirements. If the international company is also a listed company, you're going to have to be careful how disclosures work, how you have to disclose things. And it can be difficult because of language differences, timeliness of disclosing. But there are companies which are jointly listed for many years now. So it's just something you have to think about if you're a listed company. CSDC about the securities account, but that's more a mechanical thing. SAMR, which it used to be, I guess, called SAIC, but has an expanded scope. If there's an antitrust issue, they'll be relevant. If the business is negative for foreign investment, probably won't affect the listed company, but might affect a joint venture if you're doing it with a listed company, whether you're allowed to do it. MOFCOM, will be a little bit about the strategic investments by foreign investors in listed companies, but I have the feeling that MOFCOM welcomes these kind of strategic stakes. And you can see in the draft regulations recently that it's proposed that they'll lower the requirements to make such investments, lower the lockup periods. So I think they're keen to actually nurture this and have more companies invest like this. And then SASAC, I think it's probably not a problem for Star Exchange companies, but for the more traditional listed companies, sometimes people forget that a listed company can still be a state-owned enterprise. So if your partner is a state-owned enterprise, even though it's listed, SASAC, which is the body that supervises state-owned assets, yeah, they can be relevant, and it's another layer of complexity. And then finally, SAFE, again, that's more of a process, bringing money in, bringing money out. That'll be something you just have to keep an eye on.
And this is just a list of relevant regulations. And Mark, you touched on even the draft securities regulations that's going to lower the thresholds. But more from a more general perspective, I guess we can separate this into the securities related laws and also the foreign investment related like corporate laws. So Mark, I know you touched a little bit before that, you would usually work with your securities team for a project like this. What is that, how does managing a project like this usually happen, behind the scenes from the law firm point of view?
So I think, the securities stuff is, again, more process. So it probably requires less creativity. So the securities law will, limit certain things, like, what kind of stake you can take. Is it 5%, 15%? Is it higher? What kind of influence you can get in a listed company, although that might be also corporate, but also the mechanics of doing it, the, how those shares are issued. So I think that's the speciality, which again is more process. I think with the corporate lawyers or the people dealing with foreign investment, what they will look at firstly is, well, is this a sector open to foreign investment at all? And what do the companies want to achieve and how they will achieve it, and come up with a plan and then work with the securities guys to implement it. I think to date, we've never really had a major problem. It's mostly, early on, you would like set up a Gantt chart. So show all the steps, what you have to consider, and that gives people a good framework. And so I think first you have to discuss how do you align the business. But I think we discussed that in a later slide. But once you have the idea of aligning the business and what kind of stake, I think the first thing is, if you're looking at a strategic stake in a listed Chinese company, I don't think that the international partner will be running the show. So, this really requires you to understand that you're along for the ride, and, it may be a very profitable ride, it may be a very useful ride, and there may be even a cross-border alignment. I haven't seen a share swap, although that's possible. We saw it years ago, but between limited companies, which I don't think is possible anymore. But probably it's happened, I just haven't noticed it. But probably there will be strategic alliances whereby large Chinese companies have cross holdings with large international companies in order to, cover the whole globe. So I think, as we see, maybe it will be, China will be more, not just the China market, it may be Southeast Asia, and maybe Africa could also be, it's expected, I guess, that Africa will be the next big area of growth, I could imagine. China's well placed there. So I think, that's how it would work. So securities is more about the process, but the corporate lawyers will normally work with the client to work out what the project, how it could look. Especially when you have
those projects that end up with some type of joint venture where, it's more than just an investment in shares. It's an actual push of the business in China's market. So, it's saying, a JV is, kind of a overstatement, because there is many strategic issues. And we'll get into some of these issues here, and just a little bit of foreshadowing: technology, IP, branding. A lot of these things are need consideration. So Mark, I have here, maybe we'll just do them very bullet style, but these are just, the next few slides are just going to be different strategic issues that, do come across from this, not process oriented, but more strategic oriented thought process. And the first, which you alluded to, was alignment. Maybe you want to tell us, what do you mean by alignment?
So I think, it's important, like we discussed, it's really unlikely that a international industrial or company that really has a business, not just an investment type of company, it's unlikely that they would invest in a wholly different type of business. That doesn't really make sense. It doesn't add value to the Chinese side. And there's lots of people with money who spend time looking at these things. So I think, it's important to know, how do you compete? How do you deal with it? And it's quite complicated, I think. So the alignment is an issue. All the cases we've seen with the strategics doing these stakes, it always starts with an ambitious person somewhere in the international company. It could be an international CEO who really wants to build something in China. It could be the country manager of China wants to really, increase the footprint. So there's normally this, for the strategic, I don't think it's normally about, having a punt and hoping that you get a big multiple after a few years. So there's normally that strategic idea. And so we've seen it where people think they can improve an existing Chinese business. So, one thing we saw was a production line. It was a European company. The production line was like a processing type of plant, and they were able to do 80%, automation. But the Chinese company was involved in AI and other things, and they believed they could fully automate it. So that hasn't gone ahead yet, but that's an interesting kind of product. And then, there'll be an issue whether we have another client who's in the textile business. Their partner is a very large Chinese listed company that is a supplier of the material. Now, the question is, they'll bring in the China business of the international company, and, the joint venture will produce this type of product. And so, that's a downstream relationship that has to be managed. And, they will keep their overseas markets, except for some markets. So it's always a bit complicated. But if you don't actually have some, overlap, you don't have any synergy. So I guess that's something which people have to think about very high level. And it's normally within China, is there a separation of the market? Sometimes it's a different product range. Maybe sometimes they say, like with Putzmeister and Sani, which bought Putzmeister, they have Putzmeister as the premium product. Sani is the more affordable product. Maybe that's a way you look at it. And then the other alignment will be geographic. Can the international company, get exclusivity for everywhere outside of China or everywhere outside of Asia? So I think that's how we look at it.
I think I think on one hand, it's a very natural starting point, to think about how do you align, but it gets more complicated, especially when we're talking about international technology companies and star market companies, where there are verticals that are still being explored, and there's still much more new ways to synergize different types of products that might on the surface not look like it congruent. So I think this is an area that does require some more in-depth thought than what may appear on the surface.
You might think, for example, there's not that many of these strategic cases yet. I mean, at least we don't know them because they're not always announced. But if you look at joint ventures, we've had a lot of joint ventures in China, and the ones that have been really the most wildly successful, even if they have their stumbling and they have their falling outs occasionally, you look at the big automotive joint ventures like, Volkswagen's joint ventures, GM's joint ventures. These joint ventures were wildly profitable for the international partner. And even, I know that some of them now want to buy out those joint ventures, but to start up that business, even if there wasn't the legal requirements to do them as joint ventures, it's really questionable. Would they have been able to really, conquer the Chinese market by themselves, even those big automotive companies? So I think, it's not unusual that companies that are successful manufacturing or providing services do end up collaborating with Chinese companies in a similar sector. I think it just has to be managed, and you have to be realistic about what you want to do.
So the second issue we have is timing, and I guess timing is everything. So, Mark, you've seen a few of these. How does a project usually think of it from a time perspective? Or is it? And I know we talked a little bit about this before, but do you want to wait until the company is listed, or do you want to, if you have a working relationship pre-IPO, do you want to try to get in at that level? What kind of strategic concerns should one have when trying to think about timing?
Well, I think it is what it is. So, if a big international automotive player wanted to take a strategic stake in a large listed Chinese automaker, well, they're going to have to go into an established listed company. I think, for some people, where I think we'll see more of these cases, because I think the established listed companies, they'll be the bigger transactions. But I think we will see a lot more nimble ones in the Star Exchange, just because there's so many companies. They are tech heavy. They speak the language of international business, and they've got cash. And I think there'll be a meeting of minds between international tech companies and these ones. And there, if you've got the right kind of Chinese tech company, they'll be looking at an IPO. If you can get in before the IPO, that makes much easier. You'll have full sway over due diligence. You'll be able to do all kinds of things. But it will depend. We do know of a case where the Chinese company is now in the starting blocks of the IPO. They've lodged the documents. That doesn't mean that they will succeed to do the IPO, but I don't think they're going to unravel the IPO just to let an international company come in and mess stuff up. So I think it will really depend on what your target is. That will determine the thing. Industrial companies are a little bit different, because for hedge funds or these private equity guys, they often invest overseas in these Chinese companies, and their only exit plan really is an overseas listing. And so it's pretty high risk. At least in the industrial company, if the company doesn't get listed for some reason, it could be a policy reason, or there's just too many people ahead in the line, at least they still have that joint venture. So it's a bit different, I think, for industrial companies compared to people just who are financial investors.
And so you mentioned joint ventures many times, but I think that this slide right here, the level of influence, kind of speaks to it a little bit more. So maybe you want to give us a little bit more idea of what you thought.
Well, I think, in these kind of friendly deals, there'll often be an investor agreement setting out, okay, we're going to invest, we're going to become a shareholder in this company, but what kind of projects we'll do? Are we going to do some strategic projects? Are we going to do a China joint venture? What will that China joint venture look like? Who owns what? We'll come to it in a minute about consolidation. That's a big sticking point for the listed companies. How will we, share the market? And then also tying the transaction together. Like I said, I think, again, unlike a hedge fund or a private equity firm, it's not just about putting in the money and getting a return on investment and exiting after a few years. So these strategic investments, people will want to know a bit about, well, how does this add value to my business globally in the long term? And how does it add value to my business in China in the long term? And so for that, we need to tie the things together. Also chicken and egg, what happens first? Do you first go into the listed company, or do you first do the joint venture? To date, we've always seen the listed company aspect go first, because the joint venture is probably easier to get through across the line than the other way around. But that's the chicken and egg type things. How do we tie the transaction together? How do we make sure it's one package, not that you get stuck with 4% but no joint venture?
So when you're tying the parts of the transaction together, is it important to negotiate both the investment agreement and the JV agreement concurrently, or how does it normally?
Well, I mean, it will be a package. I don't know if you can read what on the same days, but I guess there would be a term sheet that would outline these are the ideas, and then you would probably want to have the joint venture agreed in principle before you sign up for the investment agreement.
So you mentioned consolidation, and I think that this issue is really important because it's taking more of a perspective from the Chinese party side. So obviously, if you're making a strategic investment, you should know your goals and what are your opinions on the project. But when you say consolidation, Mark, what does that mean from the Chinese target's perspective?
So I think for the main issue, I don't think it's going to be very often a problem in the listed company. I might be wrong, but I think it's more about the joint venture between the strategic investor and the listed company. So the listed company, it has scrutiny. It needs to show investors what it's up to. And so if they can consolidate the joint venture, then they can recognize that revenue and it looks better. Now, sometimes we have strategic investors who are privately owned companies from, say, Europe or America, and I don't think they really care about the financial, magic of that. But the problem for everybody is, in order to have consolidation, you need control. So, it's often the 51%, it could be consolidation, but who's got the legal rep? Who's got the management control? And so this is an issue. And so I think we discussed at the start, the strategic alignment. I think for most of these cases, it could be that you understand you're along for the ride in the listed company, but many people will have a different opinion when it comes to the joint venture, because that will be maybe directly affecting their business. And so the international companies may be less willing to give the Chinese partner control. But that's the complexity of it. We've had one case where the solution was because both parties wanted to consolidate the revenues and also balance each other from a control perspective. And in that case, there were two joint ventures. One joint venture was a manufacturing entity, and then there was a distribution entity with a transfer pricing mechanism. And so in that case, the Chinese party controlled the distribution entity. And the reason for that was part of the sales were also to the military, and there were tender requirements that you had to be at least a joint venture controlled by the Chinese. So that was like a happy example where we were able to solve two problems with one stone. But that's what I mean. You have to look at some creative issues sometimes, or creative solutions to deal with issues.
So I guess this next issue on corporate governance, it probably falls a little bit later on the timeline compared to some of the previous slides, but it speaks directly to the issue of consolidation. And when you are negotiating the joint venture or the investor agreement, you would probably need to have some idea of how the corporate governance is going to look, how it's going to work. So Mark, what are some of the maybe generally some of the issues in this respect, and specifically for maybe like these strategic stake projects?
Yeah. So I think on the term sheet, this is for sure going to be a part. On the listed company, it really depends on what percentage you've got, how widely distributed the shareholdings are. But for the joint venture, it's very clear. It's going to be, what's the composition of the board? Let's say if it's a 50-50 or 51-49, still most likely you'd have something like 4 board members, 2 from each side. Who's going to be the chairman and the legal rep? who's the management, and then we have often two different type of management. You might have an ex-com, where it's like the general manager's the speaker for the management, but everybody has their own area and reports directly to the board. Or you might have a more traditional general manager is the only one really reporting to the board. And so I think Americans tend to feel comfortable with that, and the Chinese definitely feel comfortable with that. European companies often prefer the ex-com model. Then veto rights might be important, might be about protecting your overseas markets, setting prices, those kind of things. And then shareholder contribution, is it going to be cash, which will be easy? Or is it, like I said, something more complicated, like the foreign investor is going to contribute, or it's going to let the Chinese listed company buy into its existing China business? Or is there a technology component? And then if it's technology, it can complicate many more things. Will you transfer core technology? Would it be exclusive? Will it be irrevocable? All these things could have a security law perspective, because you don't want a listed company that could be held hostage by a shareholder, which can pull the IP rights, from under its feet. So this will be not for later. This will be in the first draft of the term sheet. Maybe not pages and pages, but bullet points, on these things.
So on the topic of term sheet, so is my understanding correct, Mark, that there's a term sheet for the investment agreement and a term sheet for the JV, and how do you I assume that a lot of these issues that we've been discussing will be addressed differently on each of these term sheets. But maybe you want to just give us a general overview of the term sheets for the whole this process, and maybe some of the differences between the two.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't actually have two. I always like just to have one document, unless you really need to have two. So for example, in school projects, sometimes people have like 4 or 5 different agreements. And I always think it's much easier for people to lose or forget that there's 2 or 3 agreements if you have 5 of them. And so really, I think at term sheets, there's no magic to it. So I would put it all into one. And then, overall structure and scope, that would be the diagram, I think. I probably would put a page as a diagram and say, look, this guy puts in this here. This is the kind of shareholding. Then subsequently, the listed company will do a joint venture. The joint venture will do this kind of business. The international company's existing business in China will either fold in, continue, or however that's dealt with. So I think, that's how you're going to acquire the shares. What's the value? These are the commercial terms. And then, the strategic cooperation or / joint venture. And there you would just hit business scope, size, board, management. Yeah. And then impact on international companies' existing business. And that might also be global business. So will that joint venture in China be able to export to South Korea? I don't know. Maybe the international company already has a plant in China. Maybe it has an exclusive distributor in South Korea. So, these are the kind of things that you iron out. And the goal is, term sheet, even for something as potentially complicated as that, it shouldn't probably be more than 4 or 5 pages plus a diagram. But no use doing hundreds of pages of contracts if you can't agree the main issues.
And I really like the idea of a single term sheet, because it goes back to the tying the whole process together, with the investment agreement and also the joint venture agreement, if that's what you want to do. Well, for a lot of the Mark, for a lot of the projects that you've seen, I know that it's industrial, but is even in the industrial sector, is technology and IP must still be somewhat of an issue that needs to be addressed at some point. So what are some of the issues that you've seen in respects of tech and IP?
So I think, really, if somebody's doing something in China, on the Star Exchange or whatever, I think there's always going to be technology or IP. It would be a strange project if that doesn't exist. And I think, the questions are firstly, core technology. So some people are looking pre-IPO to really supercharge a Chinese company and say, we've got this great technology, and there's US companies, there's European companies, they've got their hands full developing their home markets or those Western markets. And so, do they have time to deal with a market as big as China, far away, different language, different copy? China's too big to do by ourselves. We have to hire people. And how many of our tech clients have we seen? They set up a wholly foreign-owned enterprise, wait 6 months, hire somebody. That person actually never joins, and it just kind of sits there for a while. And because they're too busy with their established markets, they're running to stay in place. And so I think if they can find the right kind of company, this is just supercharges the business. And I think also with this bifurcation in some sectors, we'll see more and more of this. So I guess then the question would be, let's say we looked at a project where it was a Chinese company that was really in its heart more of a software company, and there was a European company that was really a hospital operator, and they had an idea that they would set up a hospital in China, and it would be a hospital that would make money from patients. But what was more interesting was, how could we use this hospital to really develop IP and software to improve patient care, improve detection, all these kind of things. And in that case, that IP would have been jointly developed, and it would have been a standalone Chinese type of business. Another one was a company that was doing a type of slaughterhouse, and the Chinese company had the AI technology, and they would do facial recognition of the animals and improve things that way. So I think in those cases, it may be that the Chinese company will have a common ancestor, but it may develop in a different way from the international company, and the international company will be a technology provider, but it won't have its brand plastered over it, and maybe the trajectory is a bit different. And just one last point on that, it's not unheard of. IP can become messy. We had a case a long time ago where a international automotive company was purchased by a Chinese company, and one of the issues was it had part of its core technology had been licensed by yet another international automotive company. And so working out, what technology they were allowed to use, what fell within the license agreement, despite the change of ownership, this was, difficult, but it was overcome and there was no problem. So I think this is something which people shouldn't be overly scared of, but you have to just address it, and it will be a major issue for all these kind of projects.
And the last point here about the brands. I know you mentioned before about maybe the international brand will be used as a kind of the high-end version, and then the Chinese company may still continue to make their middle tier version. Have you ever seen different types of, how creative can you get in terms of branding? Have you seen companies just combine the brands together, or how does that usually happen?
We saw that a long time ago. I think it was a stupid idea. So I think almost everybody will keep the international brand, and at present, I think the international brand will be probably more like the luxury, or if we're talking about earth-moving equipment, luxury might not be the word, but like high-end, and then the Chinese company the Chinese product might be more affordable, but still a good quality product. That might continue. Or what could happen is maybe the differentiation will be the type of product. So maybe the parties would agree, let's say if it's a European company that does, I don't know, mini cranes, for example. I've got no idea, just come off the top of my head. So you could imagine the average crane size in Europe is smaller than in China. So maybe the Europeans will have their brand on their type of crane, and maybe the bigger ones are under the Chinese brand. And maybe the European companies will still Maybe the Chinese joint venture could be the distributor for the European cranes of a certain type, and maybe the Europeans could be distributor for the listed companies' big cranes. Yeah, I don't know, but it's those kinds of things which I think will probably happen. So there'll be, like I said, I think all of these strategic cases have some champion, some guy, mostly in the international company, because that's who we're seeing, who thinks, I really want to have a big China market. I don't think I can do it by myself, but how can I use China to boost sales in China, but also boost sales in Europe or America? And this is the idea. And we've had a few joint ventures, not listed company joint ventures, but one company in particular, a German company, they told me they never lost a job in Germany because they had successful joint ventures in China. They actually secured jobs in Germany and increased sales because certain products were still exported from Germany to China. So I don't think it's always going to be this economic nationalism or somehow China's the cheap place to do stuff. I think increasingly, China's not really that often the cheap place to produce stuff anymore, but it's where the market is, and you've got to be where the market is. So I think that's what some of those ambitious people in those strategic companies will be thinking, how can I really make a business that is successful in China?
That's interesting. And on the top of the recording, you did mention briefly, maybe in relation to the joint ventures and from a, I guess, foreign investment law perspective, about a negative list. And maybe for those who are not unaware, but maybe you can go over the negative list very quickly. And this is very relevant, especially to certain industrial sectors and also some technology sectors, like you mentioned the one example with the international company who ended up being invested into a security defense a company in China. So maybe just give us a quick overview of the negative list and security review.
Yeah, so I think negative list, I mean, it used to be there was a project catalog, a foreign investment guidance catalog, and that was a very, very long document. Nowadays, it's much shorter, and it's just, you can do whatever you want, but if it's on the negative list, it might be prohibited, or you might need, a type of a restriction. And so I think, prohibited things, would be maybe certain types of media, certain real-time high definition mapping is one that we've seen recently. So, if it's something very sensitive, which is like publishing or something like that, there may be a risk it's prohibited or it may be restricted. And so, I think few companies will be affected by it at the listed company level because, there's very few, you won't trigger probably the foreign investment by just being in the listed company. So I think this is more for the joint venture, and it might be for certain industries, I don't know, maybe a media company or something, maybe the investment in a listed company combined with some kind of strategic agreement, to make Hollywood movies or something. If Marvel wanted to make a bunch of Chinese superheroes, maybe Disney would invest in, I don't know, Shanghai Media Group, and then they would do a joint venture to produce Chinese content. That's something which would be thinkable. So I think that's the kind of issue. I don't think it will affect many companies. National security review, I think it even affects less companies. So it's something we have to check now. But I think it is largely a response for the Chinese authorities because everybody was putting national security reviews on their investments. So they thought, well, we better do this as well. I can only imagine if it's like a defense issue or if it's in the critical infrastructure, So I think really your chance of being affected by this, you should realize it's something you should look at. But if you're just like making chairs or, you're, I don't know, operating a manufacturing enterprise, it's very unlikely that this will be an issue for you. So I think for both of them, check them early on if there's a flag, but it's very unlikely to be an issue.
Yeah. I like what you said. I think this is one of those issues where if if you're in an industry that could be affected, you probably know early on that you may be affected. And if you're not, well, then you probably are.
If you're in that industry and you would be affected by these and you don't know, you must be very new to that industry.
That's right.
It should be pretty clear that you think you might, So if you're like selling software solutions to China's banks and you can flick a switch and, topple the Chinese banking system, yeah, you'll probably be subject to a national security review.
That's
so
right.
it's not like, it's kind of almost common sense, what would be subject to such a review.
And we touched a little bit on due diligence, but we did a whole separate episode on due diligence, which I'll put in the description below. I put this on the presentation because if you subscribe to our Art of Law email list or on Eventbrite, which you can find us, I usually send PDFs of these presentations just so that people can click the links and just go straight to the video. But I'll also put a link to this video in the description below. Mark, thanks a lot for your time. We'll have, as usual, China Art of Law series. We do every other week, so twice a month. And we'll be having a next episode next Friday. So you can check out eventbrite.com and search for China Art of Law to get notifications on when that webinar will take place and the link to that webinar. So thanks a lot, Mark, for your time.
Thanks, Sean.